What kind of war changes an empire not by defeating it, but by teaching it that the galaxy itself can hunger? In the closing centuries of the 41st millennium, as the Imperium staggered beneath endless rebellions, Xenos wars, and the slow rot of its own bureaucracy, there existed one region that still embodied the ideal of imperial order, the realm of Ultramar, a constellation of worlds governed not by superstition alone but by discipline, logistics, and reason, where the Ultramarines ruled as warrior kings and the memory of the Great Crusade still felt close enough to touch. It was here, amid the rigid harmony of tithes, fortresses, and perfectly drilled legions, that the Imperium would first learn how fragile order truly was. Long before the first bioship breached the void, long before the skies darkened with spore clouds, the stars themselves began to fall silent. Astropathic messages fractured into incoherent screams or vanished entirely. Navigation routes became unreliable, and an unnatural pressure settled across entire sectors, as though the galaxy were holding its breath. This was not the prelude to invasion as the Imperium understood it, for there were no demands, no declarations, no fleets marshalling banners of conquest. What approached Ultramar did not seek territory, subjects, or dominion. It sought only biomass, and in that single, alien purpose lay the reason this war would reshape the Imperium forever. The entity that Imperial savants would come to call the Tyranids was not an empire born of politics or ideology, but an extra-galactic extinction engine, a biological phenomenon whose arrival defied every precedent of warfare recorded in human history. Unlike orcs, they did not crave battle. Unlike chaos, they did not corrupt belief. Unlike ancient Xenos empires, they did not negotiate or scheme for influence. They consumed. Entire biospheres were stripped to their molecular foundations, oceans drained, atmospheres devoured, continents rendered sterile stone, leaving behind nothing but silent, dead worlds orbiting in different stars. This was the Great Devourer, a force that transformed planets into fuel and civilizations into raw material, advancing not with banners but with inevitability. To the Imperium, accustomed to measuring threats by fleets destroyed or territory lost, this was a conceptual rupture as much as a military one. How does an empire defend itself against something that cannot be deterred, exhausted, or reasoned with? How does one wage war against hunger given form? For Ultramar, the threat carried a deeper symbolic weight. The Ultramarines were not merely another chapter. They were the model upon which countless others were built, paragons of discipline, strategy, and adaptability, heirs to Robert Guilliman's vision of a rational Imperium. Their realm stood as proof that order could endure even in an age of darkness. The coming of Hive Fleet Behemoth was therefore not just an assault on territory, but a direct challenge to the Imperium's belief in its own resilience. If Ultramar could fall, then no corner of the galaxy was beyond reach. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, understood this long before the first engagement. Reports from the void spoke of shapes moving through interstellar space on a scale that defied comprehension, living vessels whose mass rivaled moons, whose internal structures pulsed with alien purpose. Auspex readings returned contradictions. Enemy formations behaved less like fleets and more like migrating ecosystems, self-contained, self-sustaining, and terrifyingly coordinated. Every projection suggested the same outcome. Conventional doctrine would not suffice. Wave by wave, Dread deepened as Imperial analysts grasped the nature of what approached. This was not a war that could be won through attrition, for every fallen Tyranid body became sustenance for the swarm, every engagement an opportunity for adaptation. The hive mind, an intelligence vast enough to span fleets and systems, learned from every clash, reshaping its organisms to counter Imperial weapons with unnerving speed. What fought today was not what would fight tomorrow. Resistance did not weaken the Tyranids. It refined them. Against such an enemy, Ultramar's legendary discipline risked becoming a liability, a predictable pattern waiting to be exploited. Calgar prepared his defenses with the full weight of Ultramarine doctrine. Yet beneath that preparation lay an unspoken fear. This enemy did not need to outthink the Imperium forever, only long enough. As the shadow crept closer, entire worlds within Ultramar's domain felt its presence before a single shot was fired. The shadow in the warp smothered psychic communication, driving astropaths into madness and severing the Imperium's most vital sense. Populations suffered mass hysteria, dreams filled with alien hunger, priests screaming of gods that devoured stars, commanders forced to make decisions in isolation as the comforting chorus of Imperial authority vanished into static and silence. The Tyranids waged psychological war simply by existing, their approach unraveling coordination and morale before the first landing spore ever fell. In this suffocating quiet, Ultramar realized it faced not merely invasion, but erasure. An enemy that would not occupy its worlds, but erase their very capacity to support life. The true horror lay not in what the Imperium could see, but in what it could not yet imagine. Behemoth was vast, but its size was not the most terrifying aspect. It was the implication of scale beyond scale, the suggestion that what approached Ultramar might be only a fragment of something far larger, a probe sent to test defenses rather than a final assault. The Imperium had faced countless enemies across 10,000 years of war, but all of them, in some way, belonged to the galaxy humanity knew. The Tyranids did not. They came from beyond the edge of mapped space, beyond history, beyond any context that Imperial scholars could grasp. Their arrival marked the first time the Imperium was forced to confront the possibility that it was not the dominant inheritor of the galaxy's future, but merely another source of sustenance drifting in a cosmos that did not care. Thus, as Ultramar braced itself and Marneus Calgar prepared his chapter for a war without precedent, the Imperium stood unknowingly at a threshold. This would not be remembered as a single battle, nor even as a single war, but as the moment humanity learned that conquest was not the only fate worse than defeat. If the galaxy could give birth to a hunger capable of devouring entire worlds without hatred or malice, then what did that revelation mean for an empire built on the belief that order, discipline, and faith were enough to endure forever? Chapter 2: The Shadow Before the Storm, Madness, Silence, and the Death of Hope. What kind of enemy announces its arrival not with fleets or fire, but by tearing away an empire's ability to think, speak, and hope before the first blow is ever struck? Long before Hive Fleet Behemoth revealed its true shape to Imperial censors, Ultramar began to unravel from within, not through invasion, but through an invisible pressure that settled across its worlds like a suffocating veil. Astropathic choirs faltered, their messages dissolving into incoherent fragments or vanishing entirely into the immaterial void, while navigators reported warp routes collapsing into unpredictability, stars shifting where they should not, and a growing sense of psychic nausea that no training could suppress. This was the shadow in the warp, not merely a side effect of Tyranid movement, but a deliberate consequence of a consciousness so vast that its proximity smothered lesser minds. For the Imperium, which relied upon psychic communication as the glue binding its scattered domains, this silence was catastrophic. Orders could not be confirmed, reinforcements could not be coordinated, and entire planetary systems found themselves isolated at the exact moment when unity was most desperately needed. Wave-like dread deepened as the psychological effects of the shadow spread beyond sanctioned psychers into the general population. Civilians across Ultramar experienced shared nightmares of endless hunger, of skies darkened by living shapes, of worlds stripped bare beneath an uncaring cosmic gaze. Mass hysteria followed, cult activity spiked, and riots erupted as faith failed to provide comfort against a terror that felt ancient, impersonal, and inevitable. Priests spoke of omens they could not interpret, scholars debated phenomena they could not classify, and governors found their authority eroding as fear replaced obedience. This was not the familiar panic of invasion, where an enemy could be seen, named, and resisted. It was a pervasive existential dread, a sense that something vast was approaching and that resistance might already be meaningless. The Tyranids had not yet landed a single organism, yet they were already reshaping Ultramar's social and psychological landscape, weakening it in ways no conventional assault could achieve. For Marneus Calgar and the Ultramarine command structure, the shadow represented a tactical nightmare unlike any previously encountered. The Ultramarines were masters of coordination, of layered defenses and adaptive response, but such doctrines relied on communication, prediction, and reliable intelligence. The shadow stripped these away, forcing commanders to operate in isolation, cut off from sector-wide awareness and unable to confirm whether neighboring systems still stood or had already fallen. Each world became a closed system, forced to prepare for annihilation without guidance or reinforcement. The Imperium's greatest strength, its ability to act as a unified whole, was being surgically removed, replaced by fragmented pockets of resistance bracing for an enemy they could not yet see. Calgar understood the implications immediately. This was a war designed to be won before it was ever fought. The deeper horror of the shadow lay in what it revealed about the Tyranids themselves. This was not a byproduct of their movement, but a manifestation of the hive mind's presence, an intelligence so immense that it overwhelmed the warp itself, silencing psychic currents through sheer proximity. In this, the Tyranids inverted every Imperial assumption about the Imperium. Where chaos twisted and amplified psychic energy, the hive mind drowned it out, replacing the warp's turbulent noise with a crushing, predatory focus. The galaxy did not scream in their presence. It went quiet. This silence carried profound theological implications, challenging the Imperium's belief in the Emperor as the ultimate psychic bulwark of humanity. If the hive mind could impose such silence across entire sectors, then what did that imply about the limits of Imperial divinity and protection? As days turned into weeks, the shadow's effects intensified. Planetary defense grids malfunctioned as machine spirits reacted unpredictably to the psychic suppression. Augur arrays returned false positives or nothing at all, and even the disciplined minds of the Ultramarines felt the strain of fighting an enemy that existed more as a presence than a force. Veterans reported an unshakable sensation of being watched, of standing on the edge of something vast and uncaring. Training drills took on a grim edge as the realization spread that the first true battle would occur under conditions of total informational darkness. Every defensive plan was a guess, every contingency built upon assumptions that could no longer be trusted. The Tyranids were dismantling Ultramar's strategic certainty piece by piece, turning preparation itself into a source of doubt. Among the population, despair manifested in quieter, more corrosive ways. Productivity declined as workers struggled with nightmares and waking dread. Families hoarded supplies not in response to rationing, but out of instinctive fear that the future itself was being consumed. On some worlds, entire communities attempted mass exodus, only to find warp routes unstable or entirely closed. The Imperium's promise of protection rang hollow when it could no longer even communicate reassurance. In this atmosphere, hope became a liability, something easily shattered by rumor or psychic disturbance. The shadow in the warp did not simply herald invasion. It eroded the social fabric that made resistance possible, ensuring that when the Tyranids finally arrived, they would face worlds already exhausted by fear. Calgar's response was disciplined but grim. Fortifications were reinforced, evacuation plans drafted, and kill zones mapped across probable landing sites. Yet every measure felt provisional, a gesture against a threat that refused to conform to expectation. The Ultramarines had fought chaos, orcs, and countless xeno species, each terrifying in its own way, but all of them operated within comprehensible frameworks of war. The Tyranids did not. They were not announcing conquest. They were announcing consumption, and the shadow was the echo of that hunger rippling ahead of the swarm. Ultramar was being prepared for harvest, its defenders forced to confront the possibility that their famed discipline might not be enough to stop a force that treated their entire civilization as fuel. As the shadow deepened and the silence spread, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Tyranids were not merely approaching Ultramar. They were already inside it, dismantling resistance at the level of mind and spirit before a single spore ever touched the ground. And if this was only the prelude, if this was what the Imperium endured before the first engagement was fought, then what chance did even the most ordered realm in the galaxy have once the hunger itself finally descended from the void? Chapter 3: Tyran Falls. The galaxy learns its name. What kind of war announces itself not through invasion, but through the sudden erasure of a world so complete that even its memory feels contaminated by what consumed it? The Imperium did not learn the true nature of the Tyranids through prophecy or strategic foresight, but through absence, through the quiet realization that an entire outpost world had vanished from the living record of the galaxy. Tyran had been a minor Imperial holding, strategically insignificant by the standards of Ultramar yet vital enough to maintain astropathic relays, orbital stations, and a modest population sustained by trade and industry. It was never meant to become legendary, yet it would lend its name to a species that redefined extinction. When Imperial authorities finally grasped that contact with Tyran had been severed beyond recovery, the truth emerged with horrifying clarity. The world had not fallen, it had been consumed. Where there had once been cities, oceans, and breathable skies, there now existed only a stripped husk of rock, its orbit littered with debris that spoke of biological harvesting on a planetary scale. No survivors were found, not because they had been slaughtered, but because there was nothing left to survive on. Tyran had not been conquered, it had been rendered irrelevant. Wave-like dread deepened as fragments of data were assembled into a coherent picture. Long-range augers detected residual biosignatures inconsistent with any known xenospecies, while void debris revealed structures that defied Imperial classification, organic yet engineered, grown rather than built. Atmospheric analysis confirmed the impossible. Tyran's air had been stripped of vital elements, its oceans drained, its soil reduced to inert matter incapable of supporting life. This was not devastation in the familiar sense of bombardment or exterminatus. It was total resource extraction, executed with an efficiency that suggested intent honed over countless previous harvests. The Imperium was forced to confront an unsettling possibility: that Tyran was not a target of opportunity, but a test. The speed with which it had been consumed, and the precision with which every usable molecule had been reclaimed, implied planning on a scale that dwarfed Imperial comprehension. Hive Fleet Behemoth had not stumbled upon the galaxy. It had entered it with purpose. For Ultramar, the fall of Tyran transformed abstract dread into undeniable reality. The shadow in the warp had been terrifying, but Tyran proved that the terror had substance, that the hunger pressing against the edges of Imperial space was not metaphorical but physical. Worlds could be erased not over centuries, but in a geological instant. Imperial doctrine, built around attrition and defense in depth, suddenly appeared grotesquely inadequate. How does one defend against an enemy that leaves nothing to reclaim, nothing to liberate, nothing even to mourn properly? Tyran's destruction stripped away the Imperium's comforting narratives about resilience and endurance, replacing them with the cold arithmetic of consumption. Every inhabited world became a potential meal, every population a reservoir of biomass awaiting conversion. The psychological impact of Tyran's erasure rippled outward, spreading fear faster than any fleet could respond. Governors questioned evacuation protocols they knew could not scale to entire sectors. Admirals debated strategies that assumed battles would be fought, even as evidence mounted that the Tyranids preferred annihilation to occupation. Ecclesiarchal authorities struggled to frame the event within Imperial theology, for Tyran's fate did not resemble divine punishment or heretical downfall. It resembled a natural disaster, an impersonal cosmic process that reduced faith and defiance alike to raw material. For the Ultramarines, the implications were brutally clear. If a single Hive fleet could erase a world so completely, then Macragge itself, jewel of Ultramar, was not a fortress to be defended, but a feast awaiting consumption. Marneus Calgar understood that Tyran marked the end of strategic complacency. The Ultramarines had long believed that disciplined application of force could solve any problem, that adaptability and coordination would always provide an answer. Tyran suggested otherwise. The Hive mind had demonstrated a capacity to learn, to optimize, and to harvest with terrifying speed. There was no evidence of waste, no sign of overextension, only relentless forward motion driven by an intelligence that treated entire ecosystems as units of consumption. This forced Calgar to reconsider every assumption underpinning ultramarine warfare. Defensive lines might slow the swarm, but they could not starve it. Naval engagements might destroy bioships, but each destroyed organism became a data point feeding the hive mind's next adaptation. Tyran was proof that resistance itself carried a cost, one that might ultimately favor the enemy. As reports circulated, a darker realization took hold within Imperial High Command. Tyran was unlikely to be unique. The galaxy was vast beyond measure, and the Tyranids had come from beyond its edge. If one world had been consumed so efficiently, then how many others had fallen unseen, beyond Imperial borders, beyond the reach of any warning? Tyran may have been the first to be noticed, but it almost certainly was not the first to die. This implication reframed the conflict entirely. The Imperium was not facing a newly arrived threat. It was encountering the edge of a migration that may have already devoured civilizations older than humanity itself. Tyran's destruction was not the opening move of the war. It was the first time the Imperium realized the war had already begun. The emotional weight of this knowledge pressed heavily upon Ultramar as preparations intensified. Defensive fortifications were no longer framed as safeguards, but as delays. The goal shifted subtly yet decisively from victory to time, from defeating the enemy to buying moments in which the Imperium might adapt. Tyran became a symbol invoked in briefings and training halls, a cautionary example etched into the collective consciousness of Ultramarine Command. It represented the fate awaiting any world that failed to understand the nature of the enemy. The Tyranids did not rage or hate. They calculated, consumed, and moved on, indifferent to the civilizations erased in their wake. As Hive Fleet Behemoth continued its inexorable advance toward Ultramar, Tyran's silent orbit served as a warning beacon no one could ignore. The Imperium had learned the enemy's name, but in doing so it had also learned its own vulnerability. If a single outpost world could be reduced to lifeless stone without meaningful resistance, then the defenses of Ultramar would be tested not as a matter of pride, but of survival. And as Calgar prepared to meet the swarm head-on, one question loomed with chilling inevitability. If Tyran was merely the first proof of what the Great Devourer could do, then what would remain of the Imperium when that hunger finally reached the heart of Ultramar itself? Chapter 4: The Unthinkable Enemy. When tactics begin to fail. What happens to the most disciplined war doctrine ever forged when it encounters an enemy that learns faster than it can be killed and adapts faster than it can be understood? For centuries, the Ultramarines had been defined by a simple, terrifying truth. No enemy they faced remained unbeatable for long, because every battle was studied, catalogued, and refined into doctrine that improved the next response. Against orcs, they exploited predictability. Against chaos, they countered corruption with structure. Against Xeno's empires, they dismantled command hierarchies and severed supply chains. This belief in rational warfare lay at the heart of Ultramar's identity. And it was precisely this belief that Hive Fleet Behemoth began to dismantle piece by piece as first contact engagements multiplied along Ultramar's outer defenses. Initial clashes appeared promising, even familiar: bioships destroyed by concentrated fire, ground organisms torn apart by disciplined bolter lines. But beneath these apparent successes lurked an unnerving pattern that Imperial tacticians could not ignore. Each engagement made the Tyranids stronger, not through reinforcement alone, but through transformation, as if the enemy were harvesting knowledge alongside biomass. Wave-like dread deepened as Ultramarine commanders began to notice subtle but devastating shifts in Tyranid behavior. Weapon profiles that proved effective in one battle lost lethality in the next as chitin thickened, muscle density altered, and bioforms emerged specifically tailored to counter Imperial arms. Defensive formations that annihilated early waves were bypassed entirely in later engagements as the swarm reconfigured its approach. exploiting gaps no human commander had consciously revealed. Even more unsettling was the realization that these adaptations occurred without delay, without visible command signals, and without any apparent loss of cohesion. The hive mind was not issuing orders in a way the Imperium could intercept or disrupt. It was thinking across the swarm as a single entity, processing every engagement as data to be optimized. What Ultramar faced was not an army refining its tactics over time, but a living algorithm rewriting itself in real time. For Marneus Calgar, this revelation struck at the foundations of Ultramarine doctrine. The Codex Astartes, long regarded as the ultimate expression of adaptive warfare, assumed that enemies could be understood, categorized, and countered through disciplined iteration. The Tyranids violated that assumption completely. They did not adhere to fixed hierarchies or predictable unit roles. They evolved roles as needed, birthing organisms optimized for specific conditions within hours or days. Where Imperial tacticians sought patterns, the swarm generated exceptions. Where commanders relied on experience, the hive mind rendered that experience obsolete with every encounter. The battlefield ceased to be a contest of skill and preparation, and instead became an environment in which the enemy rewrote the rules continuously, forcing Ultramarine forces into a reactive posture they were never meant to occupy. The psychological toll of this shift spread quickly through Ultramar's defensive forces. Confidence, once unshakable, gave way to unease as veterans realized that familiarity was no longer an advantage. Every hard-won lesson risked becoming irrelevant before it could be applied again. Training exercises grew increasingly grim as projections accounted for enemy variants that had not yet been observed but were statistically inevitable. Even the act of victory became suspect, for every Tyranid organism destroyed represented both immediate relief and future danger, its genetic data absorbed and repurposed by the hive mind. Resistance was no longer a linear process. It was a feedback loop that benefited the enemy as much as the defender. The deeper horror of this realization lay in what it implied about the Tyranid's intelligence. This was not instinct masquerading as strategy, nor was it a crude form of collective consciousness driven by simple imperatives. The hive mind demonstrated foresight, sacrifice, and prioritization, willingly expending millions of organisms to probe defenses, identify weaknesses, and refine future assaults. Entire waves were thrown into annihilation not out of desperation, but calculation. This willingness to sacrifice without hesitation or emotion stood in stark contrast to Imperial warfare, where every loss carried moral, symbolic, and logistical weight. The Tyranids did not care about losses. They measured only efficiency. Against such an opponent, even Ultramar's famed resilience threatened to become a liability, as the Imperium counted every fallen warrior while the swarm counted only outcomes. As engagements intensified, evidence mounted that the Tyranids were not merely reacting, but anticipating. Feints drew Imperial reserves away from critical zones. Specialized bioforms emerged precisely where defensive concentrations were weakest. On several occasions, Tyranid assaults bypassed heavily fortified regions entirely, striking at infrastructure nodes whose destruction cascaded into broader defensive failure. These were not the actions of mindless beasts driven solely by hunger. They were the maneuvers of a predator that understood systems, dependencies, and exploitation. The myth of the Tyranids as a blunt instrument of destruction collapsed under the weight of this evidence, replaced by the far more disturbing image of an enemy that combined overwhelming numbers with strategic precision. For Ultramar, this shift marked a turning point. The war could no longer be framed as a test of endurance or firepower alone. It became a contest against an intelligence that operated beyond human emotional constraints, one that treated time, loss, and adaptation as resources to be spent without hesitation. Calgar adjusted strategies accordingly, emphasizing delay over annihilation, disruption over decisive engagement. Yet every adjustment carried the implicit admission that the Ultramarines were no longer dictating the terms of battle. They were responding to an enemy that set the tempo, chose the points of contact, and learned from every exchange. The sense of control that had defined Ultramarine warfare eroded, replaced by a grim acceptance that the hive mind was always one step ahead, always refining its approach. The war's broader implications rippled outward through Ultramar's command hierarchy. If the Tyranids could adapt this rapidly to the Ultramarines, the most disciplined and strategically sophisticated chapter in the Imperium, then what hope did less structured forces possess? The Imperium's reliance on standardized doctrine suddenly appeared dangerously inflexible, ill-suited to an enemy that thrived on novelty and adaptation. Each new report reinforced the same conclusion. The Tyranids were not simply another Xenos threat to be catalogued and countered. They were a fundamental challenge to the Imperium's way of war. To fight them effectively would require abandoning assumptions that had guided Imperial strategy for millennia, a prospect as terrifying as the enemy itself. As Hive Fleet Behemoth continued its advance, Ultramar stood at the edge of an unprecedented realization. The Imperium had always believed that superior organization and discipline could overcome any foe, yet now it faced an adversary that treated organization as something fluid and discipline as irrelevant. The battlefield had become an arena where certainty dissolved and adaptation ruled, where the very act of fighting fed the enemy's evolution. And as Calgar prepared to commit ever greater forces to delay the inevitable, a grim question hung over every strategic council and every blood-soaked engagement. If the Tyranids can learn faster than the Imperium can adapt, then is resistance buying salvation, or merely teaching the Great Devourer how best to consume the heart of Ultramar? Chapter 5: Void War of Desperation. Suicide among the stars. What kind of enemy forces an empire to weaponize its own extinction, turning warships into sacrifices because firepower alone can no longer slow the advance of hunger? As Hive Fleet Behemoth closed in on Macragge, the war shifted from ominous preparation to irreversible commitment, unfolding first in the cold vacuum of space where Ultramar's fleets attempted to do what ground forces never could: stop the swarm before it reached the planet's surface. The Ultramarines and Imperial Navy assembled a defensive cordon of unprecedented scale, battle barges, strike cruisers, and escort vessels forming layered kill zones intended to thin the bioships before they could deploy their living payloads. At first, disciplined volleys of macro cannon fire and lance strikes tore through the leading organisms, rupturing carapaces and spilling incandescent biological matter into the void. Yet even in these early moments, it became clear that conventional metrics of success no longer applied. Each destroyed bioship revealed swarms of smaller organisms dispersing through space, feeding on the remains of their own dead, while the hive mind recalculated trajectories and attack vectors with relentless efficiency. The enemy did not retreat or hesitate. It flowed around losses like a tide reshaping itself mid-break, advancing regardless of cost. Wave-like dread deepened as ammunition stocks dwindled faster than projections had predicted. Bioships absorbed punishment that would have annihilated Imperial vessels many times over, their regenerative capacities rendering damage temporary unless inflicted with overwhelming force. Targeting solutions became increasingly unreliable as the swarm altered its formations, presenting false concentrations that drew fire away from primary vectors. Imperial captains reported the same unsettling phenomenon. The Tyranids were learning how the Navy fought, adjusting their approach to exploit firing arcs, reload times, and command delays. What had begun as a test of firepower devolved into a battle of attrition the Imperium could not afford to lose. The realization spread through the fleet with suffocating clarity. Macragge could not be protected through conventional naval dominance. The swarm would reach the planet unless something drastic was done. It was here, in the depths of void combat, that the Imperium crossed a psychological threshold it could never fully retreat from. With munitions depleted and formations collapsing, commanders authorized tactics once reserved for the most desperate moments of history. Battle barges and cruisers were ordered to ram, their massive hulls driven at full acceleration into the largest bioships, sacrificing crews and vessels to disrupt the swarm's momentum. These were not heroic last stands born of defiance. They were calculated acts of annihilation, cold decisions made with the understanding that every second bought in space meant fewer organisms landing on Macragge soil. Entire crews died without ever seeing the enemy, their ships consumed in collisions that tore both metal and flesh apart, creating expanding fields of debris and biological residue that momentarily clogged the swarm's advance. Victory, such as it was, came measured in fractions of delay rather than territory gained. The psychological impact of these sacrifices reverberated through the fleet. Naval officers trained to preserve assets and maintain cohesion were forced to order the destruction of their own command vessels, knowing that survival was no longer a priority. Communications logs from this phase of the battle reveal a chilling shift in language, as ships ceased to be referred to as tools of war and instead as obstacles to be expended. The Imperium's technological superiority, long considered its shield against annihilation, became irrelevant in the face of an enemy that did not fear loss and did not distinguish between weapon and resource. Each act of self-destruction reinforced a grim truth. The Imperium was not winning the Void War. It was merely slowing its own consumption. Amid this chaos, Marneus Calgar observed the engagement not as a single battle, but as a pattern repeating itself across every defensive layer. The hive mind demonstrated an uncanny ability to prioritize targets that would unravel Imperial formations, striking command ships and logistics vessels with disturbing precision. Escort screens collapsed under coordinated pressure, leaving capital ships exposed to swarms of smaller organisms that gnawed at hulls and weapon emplacements alike. The Ultramarines fought with relentless discipline, yet discipline could not compensate for the enemy's numerical advantage and regenerative resilience. Each tactical success was immediately offset by the emergence of new bioforms optimized for the next phase of the engagement. The void itself became a feeding ground, littered with the remains of both fleets, and still the swarm advanced. The deeper horror of the Void War lay in its implications for the ground battle to come. Every Tyranid organism destroyed in space reduced the swarm's strength on the surface. Yet the sheer volume of biomatter still descending toward Macragge promised a planetary assault of unprecedented scale. The Imperium's willingness to sacrifice entire fleets underscored the stakes. Failure in orbit meant extinction below. This calculus stripped the war of any remaining illusions about honor or tradition. The Imperium was not fighting to dominate space. It was fighting to prevent total erasure, and every measure taken reflected that desperation. Ultramar's skies would still darken, its soil would still be contested, and the sacrifices made in orbit would be remembered only in the numbers of organisms that never reached the ground. As the final stages of the Void engagement unfolded, it became painfully clear that even suicide tactics could not achieve decisive victory. They could only delay the inevitable. The swarm's advance slowed but did not stop, its remaining bioships adjusting trajectories to exploit gaps torn open by Imperial self-destruction. The fleet, shattered and bleeding, had done all it could. What remained of Hive Fleet Behemoth descended toward Macragge, carrying with it the accumulated knowledge of every engagement fought thus far. The Imperium had bought time at a cost measured in entire fleets, and the price of that time would soon be paid in blood on the planet's surface. As the first landing spores began their descent, streaking through Macragge's atmosphere like falling stars of flesh and chitin, one grim realization dominated every surviving command channel. If the Imperium had been forced to destroy itself in space merely to slow the swarm, then what hope remained when the full weight of that hunger finally made planetfall, and the war moved from sacrifice to survival? Chapter 6: Macragge Burns. When the world becomes the battlefield. What happens when a fortress world built to embody order is forced to endure a war where order itself becomes irrelevant, drowned beneath an ocean of living flesh that never stops coming? When the remnants of Hive Fleet Behemoth finally breached Macragge's skies, the war entered its most unforgiving phase, transforming from a desperate attempt at containment into a planetary struggle for mere existence, one that would scar Ultramar's capital forever. The atmosphere filled with descending spores, blotting out the sun in vast biological storms as tyrannid organisms rained down in numbers no Imperial projection had dared to calculate accurately. Defense grids thundered to life, macro batteries and void shields annihilating countless descending forms. Yet for every organism destroyed, dozens more struck the surface, burrowing into soil, ice, and stone to birth fresh waves of attackers. Macragge was not invaded in a single decisive strike. It was saturated, overwhelmed by a living ecosystem that spread across continents with terrifying speed. The planet's carefully planned defense zones, designed to channel enemies into kill corridors, were tested immediately, and while they functioned as intended at first, the sheer density of the swarm rendered even perfect execution insufficient. Where Ultramarine doctrine relied on controlled engagement, the Tyranids imposed chaos through mass. Wave-like dread deepened as the nature of the ground war revealed itself. Tyranid organisms surged forward without pause, not as disorganized hordes, but as layered formations where expendable bioforms absorbed fire while larger, deadlier creatures advanced behind them. Kill zones filled with bodies until the fallen themselves became ramps and cover for those that followed, neutralizing the defenders' advantages through sheer accumulation. Ammunition consumption reached unsustainable levels within hours, forcing Imperial forces to prioritize targets ruthlessly, knowing that every missed opportunity would be paid for in blood moments later. The polar regions of Macragge, chosen as the primary defensive bastions due to their harsh terrain and fortified installations, became focal points of unimaginable violence. Here, the Ultramarines and their allies fought not to repel the swarm entirely, but to slow it, understanding with grim clarity that time, not victory, was the only remaining objective. The psychological toll of this realization spread through every layer of the defense. Guardsmen fought knowing retreat meant annihilation. Astartes engaged wave after wave with the knowledge that relief might never come, and commanders issued orders that accepted total loss as an operational outcome rather than a failure. The Tyranids exploited every weakness exposed by exhaustion, shifting their assaults to pressure overstretched sectors and deploying specialized organisms to counter defensive emplacements once thought impregnable. Living artillery beasts bombarded fortifications with corrosive bioplasma. Tunneling organisms undermined foundations from below, and airborne predators harassed supply lines with relentless precision. The battlefield ceased to have a front. It became an all-encompassing zone of attrition where every meter of ground was contested repeatedly, sometimes reclaimed only to be lost again minutes later. Macrage's surface was being reshaped not just by war, but by consumption, its ecosystems torn apart and repurposed into fuel for the swarm. For Marneus Calgar, the defense of Macragge was no longer a matter of tactical elegance, but of grim necessity. Ultramarine forces executed fallback plans with clinical discipline, abandoning outer defenses to consolidate around the polar fortresses, where geography and fortification offered the last meaningful chance to slow the enemy. These withdrawals were not panicked retreats, but deliberate sacrifices, each one conceding ground to preserve lives and buy precious time. Yet even here, the Tyranids demonstrated their adaptive intelligence, redirecting pressure to exploit moments of transition and striking hardest when defenders repositioned. The hive mind understood not just terrain, but behavior, anticipating Imperial responses and punishing them with merciless efficiency. The defenders were no longer dictating the rhythm of battle. They were struggling to keep pace with an enemy that treated the entire planet as a single, evolving battlefield. The deeper horror of Macrage's ground war lay in how it reframed Ultramar's identity. This world was meant to be a symbol of stability, a testament to the Imperium's ability to impose order through planning and discipline. Now its cities burned, its landscapes were devoured, and its people were reduced to resources in the eyes of an alien intelligence. Civilians fled toward fortified zones only to be overtaken by the swarm, their deaths feeding the very enemy the Ultramarines sought to stop. Ecclesiarchal prayers echoed across Vox channels alongside casualty reports, faith and strategy intertwining in a desperate attempt to make sense of a war that offered no moral clarity, only survival or extinction. The Ultramarines fought with unyielding resolve, yet even they could not escape the sense that Macragge was being stripped of its meaning, transformed from a beacon of Imperial order into a proving ground for a predator beyond comprehension. As the battle ground on, it became increasingly clear that the Tyranids did not need to win decisively on the surface to succeed. Every hour of fighting enriched the swarm, every fallen organism recycled, every defensive tactic analyzed and countered. The Imperium's losses, by contrast, were permanent, each fallen warrior a blow that could not be undone. This asymmetry defined the war's brutality. The defenders bled for every moment they delayed the inevitable, while the swarm grew stronger with each exchange. The polar fortresses held, but at a cost that mounted relentlessly, their defenders forced into close-quarters combat as ammunition dwindled and the Tyranids closed the distance with terrifying inevitability. The war became intimate, fought blade to claw, armor against chitin, in an environment where even victory felt indistinguishable from defeat. As Macragge burned and the polar defenses strained under unrelenting assault, the truth finally settled over Ultramar's command with suffocating weight. The planet could not be saved through conventional means. The best that could be hoped for was delay, a holding action that would allow something else, some final measure, to intervene. The ground war had stripped away all remaining illusions, revealing the conflict for what it truly was. A test of whether sacrifice could outpace consumption, and whether the Imperium could endure long enough to find an answer to an enemy that did not tire, did not fear, and did not stop. And as the defenders of Macragge dug in for what they knew would be the bloodiest phase yet, one question loomed over every shattered bastion and blood-soaked trench. If an entire world must burn simply to slow the Great Devourer, then what price would be demanded when the Imperium's last lines finally faced extinction with nothing left to give but themselves? Chapter 7: The Last Stand of the First Company. What does duty mean when survival is no longer possible, and victory is measured only by how long death can be delayed? As the Tyranid onslaught ground inexorably toward the polar fortresses of Macragge, the war entered a phase stripped of illusion, where strategy narrowed to a single brutal truth. Someone had to hold the line knowing they would not live to see the outcome. This burden fell upon the Ultramarines' First Company, the veterans of countless campaigns, warriors whose Terminator armor carried the scars of centuries, and whose experience embodied the living memory of Ultramar's wars. They were not deployed in hope of triumph, but in acceptance of inevitability, sent into the breach because no other force possessed the resilience required to withstand what was coming even briefly. The polar fortresses, already battered by endless waves of Tyranid organisms, became killing grounds where the environment itself conspired against the defenders. Ice fields choked with corpses, fortification corridors slick with biofluids, and the air vibrating with the screeches of alien lifeforms pressing ever closer. Here, the First Company took their positions, fully aware that their role was not to survive, but to ensure that others might. Wave-like dread deepened as the nature of the engagement revealed itself in stark, unforgiving clarity. The Tyranids did not assault the fortresses in reckless frenzy. They applied pressure with calculated precision, throwing expendable organisms into the defenders' guns to exhaust ammunition and draw attention, while more lethal bioforms maneuvered for decisive breaches. Genestealers poured through access tunnels and maintenance shafts, their speed and ferocity testing even Terminator armor to its limits. Carnifexes advanced through kill zones that would have annihilated conventional armor, absorbing punishment until the fortress's defenses began to fail under relentless impact. The First Company fought methodically, executing firing patterns honed over centuries, sealing corridors with disciplined volleys and controlled detonations. Yet even their expertise could not erase the reality of numbers beyond counting. Every defensive success created new piles of corpses that the swarm climbed over, turning the fallen into tools of advance. Ammunition dwindled, weapon systems overheated, and the veterans adapted instinctively, transitioning from ranged dominance to brutal close-quarters combat as the Tyranids closed the distance. The psychological weight of this last stand was unlike anything the Ultramarines had faced before. These warriors were accustomed to hardship, to fighting against impossible odds. Yet here there was no expectation of relief, no reserve force waiting to exploit a breakthrough. Their sacrifice was not symbolic. It was operational. Every minute they held the line translated directly into time bought for the Imperium's last contingencies to take shape elsewhere. This knowledge stripped fear of its usual power, replacing it with a grim clarity that sharpened every action. The First Company did not fight with desperation. They fought with purpose, their movements precise even as the walls shook and the fortress's internal structures collapsed around them. In this environment, honor was not a concept discussed or displayed. It was enacted through endurance, through the refusal to break even as survival became impossible. As the battle ground on, the Tyranids demonstrated their adaptive intelligence with terrifying speed. Bioforms emerged specifically suited to breach Terminator defenses, claws and bioweapons calibrated to exploit armor joints and power couplings. Swarms adjusted their attack vectors to bypass fortified corridors, forcing the veterans into constant repositioning under fire. The hive mind sacrificed entire waves without hesitation, learning from each failed assault until the pattern of Ultramarine resistance was fully understood. Against such an enemy, even the greatest experience carried diminishing returns. The First Company's mastery slowed the swarm, but it could not stop evolution itself. Each fallen Ultramarine became not only a loss to the Imperium, but another data point feeding the enemy's refinement. The deeper horror of the last stand lay in its asymmetry. For the Ultramarines, every loss was irreplaceable. The death of a warrior whose knowledge and skill represented centuries of accumulated experience. For the Tyranids, loss was meaningless, a temporary expenditure in service of a greater optimization. This imbalance transformed the battle into a grim calculus of time versus biomass, where the Imperium paid in lives to delay an enemy that grew stronger with every exchange. The polar fortresses became mausoleums in real time, their defenders dying where they stood, surrounded by the remains of the swarm, yet knowing that their efforts merely slowed an advance that could not be halted entirely. The war had reached a point where heroism and futility coexisted, inseparable and indistinguishable. As ammunition ran dry and power systems failed, the fighting devolved into raw physical struggle. Terminators wielded power fists and blades against swarms that clawed and bit with unrelenting ferocity. Corridors collapsed, sealing both defenders and attackers in confined spaces where survival was measured in seconds. Vox channels filled with fragmented reports before falling silent one by one, each loss tightening the noose around the remaining defenders. Yet the line held. The First Company continued to fight long after any reasonable expectation of survival had passed, their presence alone denying the swarm immediate victory. This endurance was not accidental. It was the culmination of Ultramarine doctrine pushed beyond its intended limits, proving that discipline and resolve could still matter, even when outmatched by an enemy that defied comprehension. The sacrifice achieved its purpose. Time was bought, measured not in hours but in the cumulative delay imposed by every corridor held and every assault repelled. Elsewhere, forces beyond the fortresses moved into position, final contingencies prepared under the protection of the First Company's dying stand. Yet this success came at an unbearable cost. By the time the Tyranids finally overwhelmed the polar defenses, the First Company had been annihilated to the last warrior. Their armor lay broken amid mountains of alien dead, their legacy preserved not in survival, but in the narrow margin by which Macragge avoided immediate extinction. Ultramar had been saved from total consumption in that moment, but it had lost something irreplaceable. the living heart of its veteran strength. As the echoes of battle faded within the shattered fortresses, the Imperium confronted a truth it could not escape. The Tyranids had been delayed, not defeated, and the price of that delay had been the absolute destruction of one of Ultramar's most storied formations. The galaxy would remember this stand not as a glorious victory, but as a testament to how far humanity was willing to go to endure one more day. And as the smoke cleared and the swarm regrouped for its next phase, a chilling question pressed itself into every surviving mind. If the Imperium's finest could be erased simply to buy time, then what force, if any, could truly stop the Great Devourer when it returned in greater numbers, armed with everything it had learned from the blood of Ultramar's best? Chapter 8: The Breaking of Calgar. When Legends Bleed. What does it mean for an empire built on legends when one of its greatest heroes learns, in blood and bone, that even he can be hunted like prey? As the polar regions of Macragge drowned beneath endless waves of Tyranid organisms and the sacrifice of the First Company bought only moments of reprieve, the war narrowed to a brutal and intimate truth that no amount of doctrine or preparation could soften. The hive mind had come not merely to consume worlds, but to break symbols. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, had stood as a living embodiment of Imperial resilience for centuries. A commander whose presence alone could stabilize war zones and whose survival reinforced the belief that some figures stood above annihilation. That belief died the moment he faced the Swarmlord. This was not a duel shaped by honor or destiny, but an encounter engineered by a predator that had studied Ultramar with obsessive precision, shaping its apex organism not only to kill, but to dominate the very idea of Astartes' superiority. The Swarmlord did not confront Calgar as an equal opponent. It approached him as a calculated solution to a problem. Every movement it made carried the weight of accumulated data harvested from countless battles, its form refined through the deaths of Ultramarines, guardsmen, and naval crews alike. Where Calgar fought with mastery forged through centuries of experience, the Swarmlord fought with something far more unsettling: inevitability. Its physical superiority was undeniable, its strength exceeding the limits of even Terminator-enhanced resilience, its speed compressing reaction time to fractions that rendered instinct insufficient. Blows that would have shattered armored vehicles tore into Calgar's relic warplate, cracking ceramite sanctified by millennia of reverence. Each strike was precise, intentional, stripping away layers of protection as if the hive mind knew exactly where ultramarine defenses would fail under sufficient pressure. Wave-like dread deepened as the confrontation revealed the asymmetry at the heart of the war. Calgar's tactics, honed against foes that could be outmaneuvered or broken through attrition, met an adversary that did not tire, hesitate, or fear loss. The Swarmlord absorbed punishment that would have annihilated lesser organisms, its form adapting even within the engagement, shifting balance and approach as it tested Calgar's limits. This was not brute force alone. It was applied evolution. The hive mind had distilled Ultramar's resistance into a single equation, and Calgar stood at the center of it, his every move feeding a process that sought not merely his death, but his defeat as a symbol. The realization settled with crushing clarity. The Imperium was no longer fighting an enemy that reacted to heroes. It was fighting one that designed itself to kill them. The moment Calgar fell, grievously wounded and broken beneath the Swarmlord's assault, something far more damaging than physical injury occurred. The Ultramarines witnessed the shattering of a foundational myth. Their chapter master, whose survival had anchored morale through the darkest hours of the invasion, lay bleeding, his life preserved only through intervention and extraction rather than dominance. This was not martyrdom, nor was it a glorious last stand. It was vulnerability made manifest. For the chapter, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. If Calgar could be brought so close to death, if his relic armor could be torn apart by a single tyrannid organism, then no rank, no honor, no legacy offered true protection. The Tyranids had not simply wounded a commander, they had wounded belief itself. The deeper horror lay in understanding why the Swarmlord had been unleashed at that moment. It was not desperation. It was refinement. The hive mind had waited until Ultramar's defenses were exhausted, its veterans spent, its symbolic heart exposed. Only then did it commit its apex predator, confident that the conditions were optimal. This calculated timing revealed the Tyranid's true strategic nature. Patience without emotion, sacrifice without regret, and precision without mercy. Calgar's near death was not an accident of war. It was a data-driven outcome, the product of a system that viewed heroes as variables to be neutralized rather than obstacles to be overcome. As Calgar was removed from the battlefield, the Ultramarines were forced to fight on without the stabilizing presence that had defined their resistance. Command fell to those already stretched to breaking, and every order issued in the aftermath carried the weight of an unspoken truth. The Tyranids could reach anyone. The war had crossed a threshold where inspiration no longer flowed from the survival of legends, but from the grim necessity of endurance without illusions. Ultramar's warriors continued to fight, not because they believed themselves invincible, but because surrender meant extinction. In this way, the breaking of Calgar marked a transformation not just in the battle, but in the Imperium's understanding of itself. The encounter left scars that could not be healed by victory alone. Calgar survived, but survival was no longer synonymous with dominance. His wounds became a living reminder that the Tyranids did not need to kill heroes to defeat them. They needed only to prove that heroes could bleed. The chapter absorbed this lesson with grim resolve, their faith in doctrine hardened by the acceptance that adaptation, not pride, would determine survival in wars yet to come. The Swarmlord withdrew not in failure, but in completion, its purpose fulfilled, its data harvested, its impact already reverberating through Ultramar's command structure. And as the battle staggered toward its final, catastrophic resolution, one truth lingered heavier than any casualty report. If the hive mind could break the greatest symbol of Ultramar without killing him, then what horrors would it unleash next? Now armed with the knowledge that even legends are nothing more than prey that has not yet been fully consumed? Chapter 9. A victory that felt like defeat. What does survival mean when an empire is forced to annihilate itself just to deny its enemy one more meal? And even that act cannot erase the certainty that the hunger will return. By the time the final phase of the Battle of Macragge unfolded, the war had stripped away every illusion the Imperium once clung to, leaving only the raw calculus of extinction versus delay. The surface of Macragge lay shattered, its polar regions reduced to charnel fields where the remains of Ultramar's finest mingled with mountains of alien dead. And yet Hive Fleet Behemoth still pressed forward, wounded but unbroken, its advance slowed only by sacrifice so extreme it bordered on the unthinkable. It was at this moment, when ground defenses teetered on the edge of collapse and the Tyranid swarm prepared to overwhelm what little resistance remained, that the Imperium enacted its final measure. not a counterattack, but a denial. The arrival of the relief fleet did not herald victory in any conventional sense. It signaled desperation given form, an admission that the enemy could no longer be defeated through force of arms alone. At the heart of this final act stood the Dominus Astra, a vessel whose purpose would be fulfilled not through survival, but through annihilation. As it drove into position amid the chaos of the void battle, the ship became a deliberate sacrifice. Its warp drives pushed beyond every safety margin ever recorded, its crew fully aware that they were about to weaponize reality itself. When the detonation came, it did not resemble a clean explosion or a decisive strike. It tore open space with violent indifference, creating a vortex that dragged both Imperial and Tyranid matter into a collapsing singularity of fire, warp distortion, and unbound energy. Bioships that had survived fleets of macrocannon fire were pulled apart and erased, their immense forms shredded and consumed by forces far older and less merciful than hunger. The void screamed as the remnants of Hive Fleet Behemoth were torn from existence, not defeated, but denied continuation, starved of biomass by obliteration rather than resistance. Wave-like dread deepened even in this moment of apparent salvation, for the price of the detonation was absolute. The Dominus Astra and all souls aboard were erased, their sacrifice adding another silent ledger entry to a war already measured in unimaginable loss. Space itself remained unstable long after the vortex collapsed, warp routes fractured, and debris fields spread across orbital paths like the bones of a broken empire. The relief fleet did not pursue fleeing remnants because there were none to pursue. What remained of Behemoth had been erased not by superior strategy, but by desperation made cosmic. Macragge survived, but survival felt hollow, stripped of triumph or relief. The planet still stood, yet it no longer resembled the ordered jewel of Ultramar it had been before the war. Its landscapes were scarred beyond recognition, its population decimated, its ecosystems permanently altered by the passage of the Great Devourer. The true cost of the battle became undeniable in its aftermath. The Ultramarines' first company, the veterans whose experience anchored centuries of warfare, had been annihilated completely. Their loss could not be quantified in numbers alone. Terminator armor, relics whose craftsmanship could not be replicated, lay shattered or lost beneath Tyranid remains. Knowledge passed only through lived experience vanished with them, creating a void that would take centuries to even partially fill. Ultramar had survived, but it had lost the irreplaceable core of its martial legacy. Rebuilding would not be a matter of years or decades, but of generations, assuming the Imperium survived long enough to see it through. The chapter endured, yet it did so diminished, its strength preserved at the cost of its memory. Psychologically, the battle left scars deeper than any physical ruin. The Ultramarines had won, yet nothing about the outcome felt like victory. They had not driven the Tyranids back through superior discipline or strategy. They had merely denied them completion through self-annihilation. The knowledge that extinction had been averted not by dominance but by sacrifice reshaped the chapter's understanding of warfare. Macragge had not been saved because the Imperium was stronger than the Great Devourer. It had been saved because the Imperium was willing to burn itself to remain unconsumed. This realization echoed far beyond Ultramar, rippling through Imperial command as reports spread. The Battle of Macragge was no longer framed as a heroic defense, but as a warning written in blood and void fire. The deeper horror lay in what followed. As intelligence reports were compiled and long-range augurs recalibrated, it became clear that Hive Fleet Behemoth had not represented the full measure of the Tyranid threat. Patterns observed in its advance, the scale of its biomass reserves, and the manner of its probing suggested something far more unsettling. Behemoth was not the invasion, it was reconnaissance. A scout force, testing the galaxy's defenses, harvesting data, and refining biological strategies for conflicts yet to come. The Tyranids had learned from Macragge. They had learned how the Imperium fought, how it sacrificed, how far it was willing to go to survive. The destruction of Behemoth did not erase that knowledge. It merely ensured it would be carried forward by the Hive mind, integrated into future swarms of even greater scale and efficiency. Macragge stood, but it did so as a scarred monument to a truth the Imperium could no longer deny. The galaxy harbored forces that did not fear faith, honor, or sacrifice, forces that treated civilizations as fuel and heroes as variables. The Battle of Macragge changed the Imperium not by defeating it, but by exposing its limits with merciless clarity. Survival had been achieved, yet it came with the understanding that such survival could not be sustained indefinitely through sacrifice alone. Each future encounter would demand greater costs, greater compromises, until the question would no longer be whether the Imperium could endure, but how much of itself it was willing to lose in the process. And as Ultramar rebuilt amid the ruins, haunted by the silence left where the First Company once stood, a final, unbearable question lingered at the edge of every strategic projection and every whispered prayer. If a single Tyranid Hive fleet could force the Imperium to burn its own heroes, fleets, and worlds simply to survive, then what fate awaits humanity when the full, unimaginable weight of the Great Devourer finally arrives to finish what Behemoth only began?